Hello and welcome to the Glasshouse Festival, Poetry from Around the World. We bring to you over 85 poets coming together in support of creative people impacted by COVID. The Glasshouse Festival is wholly promoted by the Art Mantram Trust, which is a not-for-profit organization out of Bangalore in India that has been promoting the arts, artists, and art awareness since 1999. This session is Our Voices, Our Weapons, Queer Voices in Queer Poetry. Our panelists are Dante Micheaux, Michelle Green, Aditi Angiras, and our moderator Mriga Sethi. Mriga is a queer Indian poet, editor, and storyteller based in Singapore, whose own work is centered around the double othering of race and gender. Thank you all for being with us. Over to you, Mriga.
Thank you, Yumna. I'm so pleased to be moderating this reading and conversation between our three wonderful queer poets and writers. Aditi Angiras from India, Michelle Green from the UK, and Dante Micheaux from the US, although he's currently based in London. Thank you for joining us from your respective time zones. I also want to point out that Aditi Angiras, along with her co-editor Akhil Katyal, have just published The World That Belongs to Us, an anthology of queer South Asian poetry put out by HarperCollins this month. And in the lead up to this conversation, Aditi pointed out that typically the word queer doesn't really exist in India or in an Indian conversation of alternative sexualities, and yet it's the word that we have that's bringing all of us together today. But at the same time, highlighting the ways in which the conversation is slightly different in each of our cultural contexts. All of our panelists today are interested in intersectionality, which is, in case you don't know, a critical concept in social justice discourse that seeks to look at the overlaps of race, gender, sexuality, immigration, class, ability, and other grounds of disadvantage and advantage, either within an individual or a group. And that conversation, that intersectional work is a little bit different depending on who you ask or whose work you look at. So I'm really pleased that we'll be looking at it from so many different perspectives. Our panelists each have a different take on queer intersectionality in their work and in their home countries, and I'll leave it to them to contextualize that for us for a little bit, as well as share a few poems. I'd like to start with Aditi, who's a poet and artist based out of New Delhi. Aditi, will you start us off, please?
Thank you. Thanks, Mriga, for the introduction and putting some context into what I'm going to start reading. I thought I'll jump first in the poem and then speak a little bit about where is it coming and what's happening. So the poem that I'm going to read is from a very long time ago, but it's also, this was one of my submissions to my anthology. So it's a love letter of sorts to a poet who's played a huge hand in my own understanding of poetry, as well as my own queer reading of their work has played a huge hand in my exploration of my own queerness. So you'll find out who this poet is. It's an American poet. The poem is called My Mad Girl's Love Song. There are days when I really miss you, Sylvia. Nights like these, I wonder, what if things were different that one night and you'd met me at that party, 1956, February 25. Between the jazz and the poems, drinking whiskey and ginger wine, walking on air like a holy high, you'd stumble and step on my toes, so we'd end up dancing all night. You'd quote me my poems and I'd quote you more poems, but you'd not need to be you, confused, iberated, and I won't need to be Hughes to be huge with the ladies. I dreamed that you bewitched me into bed, oh Sylvia, and sung me moonstruck, kissed me quiet and sing. Head in the clouds you got me singing, oh Nana, what's my name? Now that we're sober, tell me, dear Sylvia, would you still die with your head in the oven, or stay 6 years later to hold my hand at the stone wall writes, say, won't you write me a poem to tell me we're real, alive, not dead, loving like fuckers and fucking like lovers, so I'd stop feeling that I think I made you up inside my head. So yeah, this is something that I'd written, as a teenager, where the poets or the writers that I'd been reading were from the West, and the first time I read a short story from a queer writer in India was Lihaf by Ishmat Chokte, and I had no vocabulary or understanding of what was going on in that story, or what was happening there. And it wasn't until I went on to do my postgrad and then my MPhil and got versed with queer theory to be able to pick up a language to sort of articulate what was going on, what was happening. And it's only been, I would say, at 30, 31, only recently that I've been, at least trying to decolonize how I have been reading in, either to my own life experiences or the community around me. And from that effort of decolonization, this anthology came out. And the entire process was, to be able to understand what goes beyond these terms and labels, and how is it that people in India and also in South Asia overall, given our shared cultural and political histories, how is it that we imagine ourselves? And I'm really excited to come across and try to read or translate different voices, different poets from different regions, and just expand what goes into and what goes out of this word queer, like Mriga you just spoke about. Currently in India, we're at a very, very crucial time, but I think so is the rest of the world, in a manner that we've just been celebrating, getting rid of 377, but various other complications like the CAA or the trans bill and various other political situations, which are forcing us to also think about what other people from marginal communities or minorities, and how does that intersectionality work into in a manner the privileged conversation of queerness that maybe I have been dealing with for so long. And that's where I thought this is a poem written by that younger self who thought this was very radical to be able to write one for Sylvia Plath. And now I feel unable and find myself at a lack of words to even express all the things that I'm able to understand and read now. So yeah, guys, that's me, and I'll hand it back to Mriga now.
Thanks, Aditi. I wish we had twice the time that we have for this session, because there are so many follow-up questions I have for you, and I'm sure the others as well. The idea is that we'll hear from all three poets, and then I'd invite the audience to ask questions of each of them. So let's save that for the second half of the session. For now, I'd like to ask Mish to read. Mish is a poet and a prose writer and an interdisciplinary artist who works with musicians and digital artists. If you could please tell us a bit about how queer intersectionality works for you in your work and in the UK more broadly. I know that's a big question, but and of course share some of your work with us.
It is a big question, and it's a really fascinating one. And I think that having the language of intersectionality, and that phrase that Kimberly Crenshaw gave us, it just identifies so many multiple points of experience that are too easily erased otherwise. That a person is never queer alone, they're never gay alone, they are never disabled alone. There's so many different points that we all speak from, and in the UK, just to pick up on something you mentioned, Aditi, yeah, we are also at interesting, I'm using that word with a barb, times, and particularly for trans communities, immigrant communities, and poor people are under very sustained and coordinated attack at the moment. And of course, there's huge overlap between those communities. So trans immigrants and poor immigrants and poor trans folk are at the sharp end. Poetry, queer poetry, to me, is an exchange. It's not something, I don't understand the poet in the ivory tower kind of idea that many people still have. That it's not something I recognize for myself and for the people that I'm inspired by. It's an exchange in our communities. And naming of ourselves and our experiences. So I want to read, I'm going to read two pieces and touch on class and the ways in which we're not deemed acceptable by the center of power, because that's where the moments of solidarity are for me. Yeah. All my favorite flowers are weeds, spreading from stone slab crack to tumbling wall to road edge to bed. A long string of common names, and when they are torn at their stalks, they spring back green with more cunning, more wit. All my favorite flowers are unashamed and unbowed, shimmying figure eights, noticing each other across distance and weather, bobbing heads, throwing up arms, cocking chins and smiling gap-toothed. I see you, they shout over the intentional regiment of bulbs and cultivars from the weekend supplement. I see you. As wave after wave of slugs and snails break against their bodies like nothing more than a stiff breeze, because all my favorite flowers are older than the gardener. All my favorite flowers are throwing their heads back and laughing at chic. They are thumbing their inflorescence at Coco Chanel and piling on accessories. Too many necklaces, too many bees, a patina of poorly considered tattoos and a haircut that doesn't quite suit, a foliage that bursts over the waistband of skinny cut jeans like the terrible swell of a spring flood, because all my favorite flowers don't give a fuck about your beauty standards. All my favorite flowers are executing rebellion, taking to the streets in last night's makeup and demanding change instead of bone meal, change instead of cloche. They are breaking concrete in lurid yellow, orange froth. They know that gardens are maintained hierarchies of opinion, and because all my favorite flowers are too much, too little, too soon, too late, they are conspiring with hard soil and punishing sun, and they are screaming themselves into this world alive. They're not waiting for you to consider them beautiful or worthy, all my favorite flowers, because their power is rhizomatic and elemental and stubborn and unashamed, and they are here despite you, blooming. And I'm going to read you one more short poem, and this one speaks straight to that debate about the humanity of trans and non-binary people that's happening in the UK and around the world right now. And this is called NB. I carry a boy inside me, always have. Feed him raisins and sealed bags of air, and this is not a metaphor about inner children and psychotherapeutic symbolism. The boy I carry inside me knows how to leap from the edge of the riverbank and crab walk his hands across water-smooth stones, which used to be boulders, which used to be mountains, which used to be molten rock reaching for air. He knows that dresses are for people and makeup is for people, and the sound of the wind moving the limbs of lodgepole pines is for every living thing. He knows which city side streets are shortcuts and which are really not. He knows that certain buildings cry out for soothing, and he knows the weight of the unborn. And this is not a metaphor about miscarriage or pregnancy or all the things a body like mine is supposed to be able to do. The boy inside me eats raisins, sips from sealed bags of warm air, knows the weight of the unborn, knows that time is a hair stretching in the dark. He draws orange lines above each eye and watches the land rise to meet the rest of the known universe. And this boy is not a symbol. This body is not a poem. This poem is not a metaphor. And the only thing I want to say about that poem is the last line, "This poem is not a metaphor," is absolutely something that I wish could become part of the conversation about trans and non-binary and queer lives. We are talked about as if we are thought experiments, and I'm not okay with that. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Mish. After telling all of you to not forget to unmute yourselves, I forgot to unmute myself, but I want to ask you more, Mish, about this idea of non-binary and trans people being thought experiments in a way that's dehumanizing. So I hope we actually are doing well on time. So I'd like to come back to that after we hear from Dante. Dante is a poet and translator. He has 2 books out, including Circus, which came out recently and won a T.S. Eliot Prize. I'll let you say more about yourself, Dante, and I'll ask you a little bit later about the other panel that you're moderating at the Glass House Festival and how that might relate to this one. Over to you.
Hello. I'm just going to read 3 short poems that sort of come out of my thinking about queerness, though Aditi outlined that word doesn't really exist as a concept in contemporary India, but about my thinking about queerness as it relates to India and the culture that has, been a significant part of my own life and my own thinking about poetry. So the first poem is called Song of the Hijra. They go out when the sun cools in the unpaved streets and alleys. Women caged in men's bodies, beloved of Bahuchara Mata, go out when the sun cools. The Hijras break their bangles to mourn the loss of Vishnu, blessing newborn boys in the unpaved streets and alleys. Women caged in men's bodies swallow fire at every turn. Beautiful chelas protecting their guru curse onlookers who sneer and spit at women caged in men's bodies, beloved of Bahuchara Mata, neither male nor female, but intersex. Evolved, they are the will of God, the keeper of prophets, the beloved of Bahuchara Mata. This next poem is called Shiva Unashamed. Meanwhile, the timbre of his meditation altered, and he was drawn to the Supreme One, the strategist, the bringer of nectar. He summons his wife, he calls his attendants, let us go into the presence of the Sustainer. There, where the Master of all things resides, Shiva made his petition. Show me the slender waist, Vishnu. I, who have known your exploits beyond time, show me all that I have come to see. I wish to touch the limbs, the blue lotus of you. And Vishnu laughed. The all-pervading one spoke to Shiva in the cant of the gods, deafening for a moment the entourage of consort and ghosts. I am the accomplisher, and you, Shiva, are the best of gods. I will show you the prize of passionate men. Laying his mace aside, Vishnu slipped into girdle, into shimmering cloth to hide his sex, and simply glanced at the pure one, causing Shiva's lust to spin like a charka. The two embraced, but the tease struggled free and began to run. Shiva caught him by the hair and held the handsome thing in his arms. A vigor grew between them, but the flirt broke free again. Shiva pursued over lakes, mountains, spilling his seed in the chase, and where it fell, the earth became fields of silver and gold. And the last poem is an ode dedicated to a friend and sort of Bengali free spirit who found himself in the mix of the Black queer scene at the turn of the millennium in New York City. Ode to Shivojit Nika. O little god of seduction, keeper of the curved backside, eater of marigolds and lust, winner of good, O betrayer maker, infant of the Himalayas, stepchild of the sunrise, patron deity of Kolkata, O ruler of infatuation, O sandy syncretistic Eros, O summer bug, dweller of the crimson temple, keeper of exquisite rings, god of Chow, O mischief, trickster of the one fate, O juvenile significance, charmer of man's will, healer of the 10th illness, O maker of dusk and fellatio, keeper of the male perspirations, O sacred silliness, ignorer of advances, this heart cannot sustain the dancing of your tiny feet. So those poems, I think, deal with my particular interest in history, not just my own history, but much of the histories that I've been exposed to. And I think that's an important aspect when it comes to me thinking about queerness and intersectionality, because as a Black American, the philosophical concepts that arose out of the thinking that was happening on the subcontinent were central to the American Civil Rights Movement. And they were also central to the sort of early thinking about homosexuality and community building in the English-speaking world. And the central figure in both of those spheres is Mohandas Gandhi, whose philosophy of Satyagraha was the central tenet of Martin Luther King Jr.'s thinking when he was a student, and him thinking about the strategies for the civil rights movement in the US. But also when Gandhi was a young law student and he was in the United Kingdom, he was corresponding with some of the earliest figures in queer history. And most important of those is probably Edward Carpenter, who would really shape most of the progressive liberal dialogue that was happening in England at the turn of the 20th century. And he is an important inspiration for many of the queer radicals who were thinking in the gay liberation front in the 1960s and 70s. And so all of those things converge in my own poetic practice and thinking, and India in particular was central to Edward Carpenter. There's a whole history of these connections to be made. And so I think it's really a wonderful thing to be able to come and participate in this festival and to have this particular panel in the context of a literary festival happening in India. And I do hope that we get to speak a bit more about those things.
Thank you, Dante. Thanks to all of you for sharing your work and talking about the motivations from which it arises. I'm just really struck by this tension between both decolonization and finding a queer discourse that is more or less decolonized, as you said at the beginning of the session, Aditi, but also what you're saying, Dante, which is the intellectual conversation among queer writers or queer thinkers across countries and across continents actually has a very rich and perhaps understudied history that I certainly didn't know very much about until we started talking about this panel. We actually are doing okay on time, and by that I mean we have about 5 minutes. I want to ask Mish, if I can, please, about what you said earlier about transgender and non-binary people being used as a thought experiment. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think something that I've been noticing in the public and political conversation in the UK is, so just for context, there is going to be a reform to the Gender Recognition Act to allow people to self-identify as the gender that they are, rather than needing to get the expensive signatures of 2 psychiatrists and years and years of sign off by cisgender, largely heterosexual white people. And there's been a huge pushback from so-called gender critical people, mostly women, who are funded by evangelical churches in the US. So there's a huge amount of money behind this, and I think they are going to be in for shock when they find out that their funders are not actually aligned with them on anything but this issue. But there's an erasure that happens, of course, of all marginalized people, and there's a couple of people that get plucked out of the community, and okay, this is our spokesperson now, this is the person who has to know everything, and those spokespeople are resisting that, because we are as a community, along with other communities being pushed to the margins more and more, talked about as if we are not. There's a dehumanization and a sort of this sort of framing of trans and non-binary people as being ghosts, as being damaged bodies, as being damaged minds, and in need of guidance by the good people with the power and the money. And I think poetry is, to me, such a powerful way of resisting that, because not only is it allowing people to speak for ourselves, and as we know, poetry is not invited into the center, but there's a freedom in that, and there's ways as well as speaking for ourselves that we reflect each other and communicate with each other, and that just feels crucial right now, because I think that most of the conversation has been dominated by things that are simply not true. So how do you resist lies and fabrications? I want to bring those into my work and pull them apart and look at them and see, like, what are these stories made of? There's so much to say on it, and I find it very hard to condense. So I hope that's that's a bit of a useful thing there, but I think that it's something that shows no signs of stopping anytime soon. And I think that the more that people, I can't believe I have to say this, and I can't believe that this is where we're at, but the more that people understand the marginalized as humans, as people who have lives and families and things that we are all doing in our lives, because apparently a lot of people need to know someone personally before they can identify that person's humanity, which is just appalling to me, but that is where we are at right now. Yeah,
it's reminding me of what Aditi alluded to very briefly at the beginning of her talk, the trans bill in India, but also that Pride this month, last month in the U.S. was because of the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter protests. Pride was a lot about talking about trans women of color and how critical they have been to the movement, to the civil rights movement in the U.S. and further. And that somehow, despite 377 being repealed in India, the trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming parts of our community are still unprotected or still endangered. I'd like to spend the final minute, if we can, inviting one of you to ask a question to someone else on the panel, if that's okay. Not to put anyone on the spot, but.
Well, I might ask Aditi, because we were talking about it in earlier discussions and you raised it now. The poem that I read, Song of the Hydra, which was written more than a decade ago, and I think, as I said, at the time felt very radical reading it around literary cafes in Eastern India. But it strikes me that it's very odd that in a way the country is now gripped in this wave of quote unquote Hindutva, and there is such rich evidence in Indian cultural and religious history of what we would now describe as trans lives. And I don't understand, with this deep turn towards those concepts, why there isn't also a rising protection of these same people who for millennia were considered sacred and were important and have acolytes and communities which worship them. And it seems to me that there's a disconnect there, and I don't know if you could speak more to that.
Surely. See, one of the things is that I think a lot of laws and a lot of understanding that we inherited from the UK, from the 200 plus years that we were also colonized, sort of that was long enough to turn things on their head, and we live with that baggage every day, and that's a lot of our fight as well. But like you spoke about this current socio-political situation, with various Hindu and Hindutva elements rising, that there is, at least in the last month, there has been some pinkwashing, as I would like to call it, happening from that space as well, because we're also discussing, like I said, the CAA, etc., where it's Hindu, including some sections of the queer community, versus a lot of Islamophobic, all of that used against many kinds of different people that are out there. So there is a conversation which talks back to history and tradition and religion, but I feel that's also a dangerous space to always have to look over our shoulder at a history to justify that this is in our blood, this is in our families, because there's so much else to look around, and I think that might be a peculiar problem, at least in India and South Asia as well, because there's more than one kind of people, and this othering can happen on different ladders of not just class but also caste, which is just embedded in everything that we deal with, and then different issues with linguistic and geographical locations, and how that ladder just plays out, and who's at the receiving end of all of this is quickly shuffling. And I don't know, for me, I think it's a lot less about looking at my roots and a lot more about how those roots have been extremely instrumental in a lot of discrimination over the years as well. So, yeah.
We're getting to the point where I invite everyone who's watching this video to join us on Zoom now for a live Q&A. So if there are follow-ups that you would like to ask of our panelists, you can do that on Zoom. I believe there will be a link at the bottom of this video directing you there. And if you're too shy, I have several more questions I could ask our panelists, but hopefully you'll send us some on Zoom in a couple of minutes. So thank you, and we'll continue this conversation momentarily.